He pressed a yellow notice flat on my kitchen table 2 days after we buried my daughter and said, 30 days, Mike. Consider it a fresh start. That was the moment grief learned what contempt feels like, when a son-in-law tried to turn my home into his exit strategy. He changed the locks on my shed, staged my living room for a life without me, and expected an old man to disappear quietly. I didn't raise my voice. I raised the papers that would speak for me. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from all over the world. Your comments create a community where storytelling thrives, and we're so grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a journey that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Let's get started. I have spent most of my life taking things apart and putting them back together until they could carry their own weight again. Boats, porches, stubborn hinges that squeal like gulls, everything in Cape Elizabeth teaches you about weather and patience. At 61, with my hands nicked and my knees remembering every ladder rung, I live behind my daughter's house in a carriage house I stripped to the studs and rebuilt the winter my wife died. The place sits on the shoulder of the bay where the wind comes straight off the Atlantic. In March, the nor'easters bully the shoreline. In August, the fog drifts in like a thoughtful guest, quieting even the lobster boats. The main house is white clapboard, Emily's choice. My shop glows like honey when the afternoon sun hits the fir boards. I keep lists on a corkboard above the planer, shingles to replace, flashing to check, sump pump tests before the next storm surge. The lists are part insurance and part ritual. A well-cared-for thing repays you, my father used to say, tapping his pipe. I suppose that's why I never minded tending both houses, though only one legally has my name on the mailbox. Work is a language I trust more than promises people say they will honor. Emily loved the house before she loved the man who married her. She'd sit with a pencil behind her ear and sketch built-ins for the breakfast nook while I measured the sag in the joists. She had her mother's eyes and a steadiness that made rooms feel lit even on overcast mornings. When the doctor said the ugly word for the first time, she laughed and told them she had a project deadline. That was Emily, gentle, stubborn, never wanting anyone to fuss. Chase came later with a pressed shirt and smooth talk about valuation models. He works as an insurance adjuster and likes a tidy narrative. The numbers say, therefore, the world must agree. I didn't argue. I smiled, tightened bolts, and let him believe what he needed to believe about who kept the roof sound and the gutters flowing. Pride is a fragile boat. I tried not to punch holes in his. Neighbors drift in and out like tide. Mrs. Connolly from the next lane brings blueberry bars when warnings go up. Pete Mahoney, retired lineman, helps me lash plywood when the barometer drops. Denise Alvarez, who wore the badge for 20 years, showed me how to angle the new camera so wind-whipped branches don't trigger false alarms. They are my people. New Englanders who speak most clearly in actions. A shovel on your steps, a casserole on your stoop. I keep other lists that I don't pin on cork. Who to call if the sump fails while Emily is in treatment. Which pharmacy actually has her anti-nausea medicine when the hospital runs short. The exact sound the furnace makes before it needs a new nozzle. When grief moved into our lives, it didn't slam doors. It stood in the halls and breathed. The house learned to carry that weight along its beams. There is a long table in the carriage house where I lay out bills, sketches, and repair tags like charts. Paul and Guyen at the Harbor Bank set up a conservative little account for me years ago, something to catch rain if the roof ever failed. I never talked about it much. In a town this small, privacy keeps friendships clean. Nora Whitaker, who grew up 2 grades behind Emily, became a trusts and estates lawyer. She checks in and reminds me to keep copies of everything. Evening is when the house remembers us best. The clapboards hold the day's warmth and the gulls quiet. Emily would open windows until the curtains breathed, then sit on the steps with tea while I checked the skiff lines. Sometimes she'd hum pieces of a hymn she liked. Sometimes we just listened to the foghorn pacing the harbor. Home is a sound, she told me once. I think she was right. I don't talk much. When I do, I prefer nouns that can be fixed to a stud. But I know the slender economics of a single income and a sickness. I know what storms do to shoreline and to pride. I know a house survives because someone climbed the ladder in November with cold knuckles and a decent length of flashing. If that someone is an old man with bad knees, so be it. These are the things worth knowing before anything else I will tell you. A man is the sum of what he tends. A house is the sum of what it survives. And a father is the sum of promises he keeps even when no one is counting. The wind is rising again tonight. I have tightened every latch I can reach and set a bucket under the drip that only appears when the rain comes from the southeast. Tomorrow there will be new lists. For now there is the steady clock and the smell of salt and cedar and the quiet, faithful dark. I breathe and wait for morning. 2 evenings after the funeral, the house still smelled like lilies and casseroles cooling into starch and salt. My funeral jacket lay across the ladder-back chair where I dropped it, a black punctuation mark that refused to end the sentence. I folded Emily's gray shawl along the crease where her collarbone used to warm the wool, rinsed the last teacup she'd favored for Ginger, and set the saucer to dry at an angle so water could escape. Small motions, neat as stitches, were the only language I had that didn't fray. A slant of coastal dusk pressed against the windows. The tide was turning, and the foghorn measured it out like a metronome. I straightened a frame, Emily and me in front of the clapboard, her pencil tucked behind one ear, and felt the wall steady under my palm. Grief is a carpenter, too. It adjusts, checks for plumb, makes sure the weight lands where the studs can bear it. The front door opened without a knock. Chase entered with the brisk air of a man on a schedule, phone in one hand and a yellow envelope in the other. He glanced at the casserole lineup as if comparing brand labels, then fixed on the table. He did not look at the photographs. He didn't even pretend to. He slid the envelope forward and tapped it with one clean fingernail. 30 days, he said. This formalizes a transition. The paper had the dry smell of toner and a tone that scraped bone. I read phrases that pretended to be neutral and weren't. Guest accommodations, parcel, surrender of possession. The letterhead belonged to a local firm that does volume landlord work. The signature block carried his name alone, small, ambitious, certain. Emily's name had already migrated to the tense where it cannot sign. He began listing logistics, each one as bloodless as a line item. Smart lock credentials will change tonight. A locksmith will repin the shed for security. He glanced at his phone. You'll have access to clothes, toiletries, keepsakes within reason. I've itemized what's appropriate to take from the carriage house. The words landed like nails driven where wood should not be pierced. He produced a glossy brochure with an egret on the cover. Silver Gull Assisted Living has a base of $220, he said. It's close, safe, and cost-effective. He looked up with a managerial smile. Selling the woodworking equipment could cover the gap. I didn't answer. The brochure's font tried to make the arithmetic sound like sunlight. My mind did its own math. Social Security's thin monthly rope, a lean savings account meant for roof patches and outboard repairs, intake fees that bloom like mold when you add meals and medication management. I could see the calendar squares running out of money by spring. The numbers were an undertow. He tucked the brochure back and added, almost casually, Lexi will phase in next month. She's already pulled a coastal north mood board. The phrase rebranded a living room into a project site. On his screen flashed a caption draft for a rental listing that hadn't yet learned its place in time. There was the house, filtered and brightened, divorced from the fatigue of lilies. There were phrases like light-filled and steps to shore. I stepped outside long enough to try the shed. The keypad blinked red. A minute later, my phone chimed with an automated notice the smart lock administrator had changed. Through the glass, the green of my festool cases sat like sealed lungs. My livelihood and my name were in there. the measuring tools that taught me the difference between almost and exact, the drill whose trigger I know as well as my own knuckles. I pressed my hand to the pane and felt only the day's fading heat. Inside, Chase was still at the table, tidying grief into bullet points. "We'll be refreshing the space," he said. "Emily's things are emotional clutter. It's important we move forward." The sentence buckled under its own polish. I pictured the shawl, the pencil behind her ear, the way she called home a sound. Words like refreshing and clutter grated across those memories like sandpaper on varnish. I sat and read the notice again, the dates, the method of service, the part where he presumed a right he didn't yet hold. Arrogance often forgets the corners where dust gathers. I traced those corners with a calm finger and made no argument. I have learned that a man who needs to be loud is seldom listening. When they left, Chase with his envelope, the house with its new password, I finished drying the teacup and set it upside down. I turned off the smart speaker because the house should not answer to voices tonight. I walked to the carriage house under a salt wind that had sharpened with the falling temperature, unlocked my own mechanical deadbolt, and closed the door behind me with the soft authority of a habit that still belonged to me. At the drafting table, I unlocked a drawer and took out a blue file folder labeled in block letters, Harbor Light Trust. Paper has its own ballast. I laid out maintenance ledgers thick with weather and receipts that smell faintly of cedar and gasoline. I added the envelope Emily had left with a penciled note, important, Dad, and did not open it yet. Some doors you approach with both hands washed. Around the documents I placed the objects that have always steadied me before storms. The nautical map Emily sketched by hand, our routes threaded in pencil up the coast toward Monhegan, sat to the left like a coastline of intention. A brass key to a metal lockbox, my father's, weighty as a vow, rested above the trust papers. On a small sticky note in Emily's careless loop, Nora knows the update. The square of paper was light enough to blow away. I set a carpenter's pencil across it as a promise. The notice Chase had served lay where I'd left it on the table. I slid it under the cedar paperweight I carved the winter the oil prices spiked, a small block that still holds the scent of the hillside it grew on. The gesture was not symbolic for anyone but me, and that was enough. I switched off the lamp and let the room gather itself around the geometry I had made. Trust, ledger, key, map, note. Outside, the gulls had gone silent. The foghorn kept counting. In the morning, I would call Nora. I did not yet know exactly how the papers would speak for me. I knew only that they would and that I could be quiet long enough to let them. Fog lay low on Shore Road when I left before sunup, the kind that beads on eyelashes and turns every porch light into a halo. I eased the old pickup out of the driveway with the Harbor Light Trust folder seat-belted beside me like a passenger. The envelope with Emily's handwriting, important Dad, rode in the pocket of my jacket, warm against the ribs. The road into town was a gray ribbon with gulls posted like sentries on the telephone lines. I drove slow. You don't rush a day that's going to ask you to remember names on papers. Nora's office sits above a bait shop and looks nothing like what it's over. She keeps the place spare. Coastal prints, a ficus that refuses to die, a kettle that begins humming the second she turns on the lights. She glanced at my hands before the folder, saw the nicks, the pitch stains that never quite wash out, and pulled a conference chair as if to make room for work that mattered. I laid everything out by instinct. Trust, ledgers, tax receipts, camera invoices, a stack of repair tags in order of storm dates. She put on thin blue gloves and moved through the pile with a rhythm I recognized from boatyards. Examine, note, set aside, reach again. She logged each document, photocopied, and slipped originals into acid-free sleeves. When she lifted my maintenance ledger, the corner of her mouth moved. "This is forensic gold," she said, then returned to the deliberate quiet that good work prefers. The trust instrument from 2012 came first, a thing I'd set up when the world went sideways once already. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. Harbor Light was a bucket under a roofline I didn't trust. Nora traced amendments I barely remembered signing, the way you trace a seam checking for gaps. She pulled a different file, thin and stamped, and slid it to me. The prenup Emily and Chase had agreed to because his mother wouldn't bless the wedding without a signature. The paragraphs were colder than January, but they were clear. The Harrington parcel, what my father called our square of wind, and any pre-existing trust assets were outside marital reach. There was even a clause, quiet as a hinge, giving emergency transfer rights to the trust if abuse or incapacity appeared. She opened Emily's updated will next, 2 months old, the ink still looking wet in my head, and the transfer on death paperwork that sat beside it like a bodyguard. The language drew a hard line from Emily to Harbor Light and from Harbor Light to me. Life tenancy in the carriage house, trustee authority over maintenance and occupancy of the main house, control when memory and dignity were at stake. It was the kind of writing you stand up straighter for. I didn't speak. I pressed my thumb to the page near her name until the pulse settled. Nora closed the folders and switched to plain speech. Maine, she said, does not argue with a trust that predates a marriage and a will that echoes it, not when filings are clean and signatures are witnessed. A 30-day notice flung across a kitchen like a paper dart wouldn't hold against that chain. The hazard wasn't law, it was time. Time for someone to change a lock, post a listing, dispose of a keepsake while we were being polite. We needed a status quo order immediately, and we needed to show the facts before tempers made facts look like opinions. We would hold a will reading, not theater, not spectacle, a structured disclosure where paper spoke, and we gave Emily the dignity of a prayer before we read what she'd prepared us to hear. The church hall by the seawall had the right bones for it, neutral ground, room enough for anyone with a standing interest to sit and breathe. Pastor Carter would open. Nora would chair, I would sit where I could see the door and the windows. We made a list of who should be there because truth has better traction when it's witnessed by people who fix things. Paul and Gwen would confirm the trust accounts and the stubborn logic of payment flows that began long before Chase's shirt collars. Denise Alvarez would bring photographs and camera logs to mark the smart lock change and the shed repinning for what they were. Perimeter games. 2 neighbors would attend to say what they saw without adjectives. A couple of Emily's friends would sit close to the front so the room remembered why we had gathered. Then we choreographed the evidence because that is what you do when a storm is inbound. Nora wrote the order on a yellow pad, trust prenup will/T, OD, ledgers for tax and maintenance, smart lock and camera documentation. Each would have a clean 1-line summary and a copy for the table. She drafted courtesy notices for Chase. Cease and desist on any rental listing. No entry to the carriage house. No disposal of keepsakes. She printed them with delivery receipts and lined up a constable if one proved necessary. The kettle clicked off. We forgot to pour the tea. While she typed, I watched her hands and felt the odd calm that comes when the right tool is in capable fingers. Revenge had the wrong weight for me. This was guardianship. Emily's note at my ribs cooled to paper again. I wanted to open it there, but you don't cry on instruments. By early afternoon, I drove back through fog that had lifted into a pale, wintry blue. At the house, Lexi stood in the living room posing a linen throw across the arm of Emily's chair. A tablet on the coffee table displayed a mood board titled Coastal North, Bleached Woods, Drifted Whites, a schedule of posts. On her phone, a draft caption glowed, Light-filled 3-bed coastal gym, available next month. I said one sentence, there's a reading tomorrow at the church hall, 3 o'clock. She blinked like a tourist caught by weather. I didn't wait for an answer. I checked the shed for formality's sake. The keypad denied me, red and certain. I photographed the denial screen with a timestamp and the angle of my own shoulder in the reflection. Evidence doesn't care for drama. It likes a clean edge and a date. Evening thickened into rain. In the carriage house, I set the documents in their planned order, squared the corners, and placed the cedar block on top of the yellow notice, as if weighting down a curl taco in a strip of molding. The foghorn kept the harbor honest. My phone chimed Nora's calendar invite for tomorrow's reading mid-afternoon under Pastor Carter's name. I turned off the lamp, stood a moment in the quiet, and felt the line where grief becomes resolve. Thin, tensile, true. The storm that had lived in our weather all week was about to arrive indoors, and I had the charts ready. By late Thursday morning, the marine layer had sunk so low it felt like the bay was breathing against the windows. Gulls rode the onshore push like kites. The barometer I keep by the shop door ticked down a hair, a small pressure drop that matched the feeling in my chest. I had stacked the Harbor Light Trust folder and the ledgers in a canvas satchel, then set them by the door where I wouldn't trip on them. Paper first, then weather. That was the order for the day. He spoke in a tone reserved for weatherproofing decks. This is a compassionate logistics plan. He did not look at Emily's photographs on the mantel. He pointed his pen at columns, at boxes labeled options, at a line that read projected move date. The numbers had a false cheer the way a brochure prints sunlight over a window that faces north. He proposed selling the tools next, a liquidation line with a generous guess at market value that proved he had never priced Festool or used a domino joiner in anger. He called the shed underutilized space and gestured toward it as if it answered to him. I could see the keypad through the kitchen window, a gray square that now treated me like a stranger. From a folder pocket, he pulled a typed page titled Allowed Items List, clean font and cheap paper. Clothing and personal toiletries were permitted. Ledgers were not. Boxes marked Emily. Keepsakes were to be reviewed for sentimental relevance and storage feasibility. He set the page on top of the binder as if it were a napkin under a glass. I felt the old carpenter's refusal rise in me, the one that starts in the feet and stiffens every rung on an unseen ladder. I asked for time. I asked for 60 days to mourn and sort, to make arrangements that matched a human life instead of a spreadsheet. I said I would not sign anything while my shed was locked against me or while keepsakes were being triaged like debris. My voice did not climb. It went low and even, the way you speak when a plank is cracked and you are telling the crew to step back. He shook his head. Procedure is procedure. He said he had already set a locksmith schedule and penciled a phase-in date for Lexi. He described grief as a barrier to healthy progress. The phrase hung in the kitchen like chemical smell. He closed the binder as if that concluded the discussion and checked his phone for his next appointment. Lexi drifted through the rooms with a tablet held like a serving tray. The screen showed a palette called Coastal North, driftwood whites, grayed blues, bleached wicker. She placed a linen throw at an angle on Emily's chair, then removed a cluster of frames from the mantel and stacked them face down on the sideboard to declutter. She read quietly from the tablet, practicing copy for a preview post that would avoid specifics while promising light and calm. The house felt like a stage being reset between acts. I picked up the frames and returned them to the mantel, the way you return tools to their hooks before you close the shop for the night. Denise knocked a measured knock and stepped in out of the damp. She wore her retired officer windbreaker and practical shoes that didn't leave marks. I walked her to the shed. She photographed the keypad and its denial screen, then had me hold the phone so the reflection showed my shoulder and the date in one frame. She recorded the smart lock status on the main door and noted the change. Back at the table, she opened a small notebook and helped me draft a one-paragraph notice. No disposal of personal effects, no entry to the carriage house, no listings or showings, no further lock changes until after the reading. Do not sign anything today, she said. Do not move anything you would miss if it vanished. Keep a log. I wrote the time and her exact words in a lined book under the date with the same pencil I used to mark cuts. When she left, the house resumed its careful quiet. I took the Harbor Light Trust folder from the satchel and checked the order one more time. Trust instrument, amendments, prenup, will and transfer on death, tax and maintenance ledgers, smart lock documentation. I added the sealed envelope from Emily and felt the weight of the brass key to my father's lockbox settle in my palm. These were things that made a kind of ballast. They did not need to argue. They only needed to be present at the right time. I ran the numbers again because fear likes to pretend it is arithmetic. Social Security's slim rope, a modest savings account for roofs and engines, intake fees that blossom when you add meals and laundry, and the kind of help a person resents until he needs it. I could see the cliff edge if I complied. I put the 30-day notice under the cedar paperweight and pressed my hand to it until my pulse slowed. I turned off the smart speaker so the house would not listen to anyone who wasn't family. I taped a note to the fridge in block letters. Will reading, Church Hall, Friday, 3 p.m. All parties expected. No argument there, just a schedule. I phoned Pastor Carter and confirmed the opening, told him I wanted dignity first and facts second, no theatrics. I asked if he would keep a small keepsake for me afterward. He said of course, and his voice had the shape of a blessing even over the line. The wind stiffened toward evening, pushing rain against the cedar like a hand reading Braille. I locked my mechanical deadbolt on the carriage house and set the incident log beside the blue folder. Nora's checklist arrived by email. Cease and desist queued, exhibits ordered, witnesses confirmed. I read it twice and felt the house set its feet. Chase made one last pass at the doorway on his way out. It's better if you start packing tonight. I wrote the time and the sentence in my log and answered only, I won't sign or pack until after the reading. He looked past me toward the shed and left without replying. When the rain came steady, I zipped the canvas satchel, placed the cedar block over the notice, and turned off the lamp. The next door I opened would be the church halls. Paper and procedure would do the talking. The bay kept breathing against the windows, and I breathed with it until sleep finally came. The church hall smelled of lemon oil and salt-damp wood, a clean old scent that made people lower their voices. Folding chairs stood in even rows under stained glass that ticked with rain. Pastor Carter placed a small bowl of lilies beside a framed photo of Emily, then met me at the door with a quiet nod. I arrived early with the canvas satchel and chose a seat where I could see both the entrance and the exit, a habit from job sites and hospital waiting rooms. Nora was already working the long table like a quartermaster. Binders wore spine labels in tidy block letters. Each stack of copies was squared to the table's edge. Paul Nguyen slipped in with a slim portfolio and the calm of a man who knows his numbers won't wobble. Denise Alvarez sat 2 rows back with a manila folder, a practical raincoat still wet at the cuffs. Our neighbors took their places without fuss, and 2 of Emily's friends sat together near the lilies, hands folding and unfolding in their laps. Chase arrived a few minutes late, jaw tight, Lexi 1 step behind with her phone held low. Their entrance had the borrowed confidence of people who believe rooms bend to pace. They took chairs halfway up the aisle, as if that gave them leverage. Outside, the rain found a steady rhythm. Inside, the air settled. Pastor Carter lifted his hands and the room followed. He prayed short and plain, gratitude for Emily's life, petition for honesty among the living, mercy for those who had to hear what they did not wish to. When the amen murmured back to him, I felt a knot climb down one vertebra. He stepped aside. Nora stood at the podium and set the frame. We're here to read Emily Harrington's updated will and to review the instruments that govern the property in question, she said. The agenda is straightforward. We'll proceed with the trust, the prenuptial agreement, the will and transfer on death designation, payment and maintenance records, and finally perimeter documentation. Please hold questions until the end. Her voice was the kind that clears fog. She began with Exhibit 1, Harbor Light Trust, established in 2012, amended cleanly, witnessed properly. She summarized without flourish a premarital trust associated with the original Harrington parcel and related interests, a consistent pattern of disbursements covering taxes, insurance, and maintenance over many years. Copies went down the rows like bread. Faces change the way faces do when a story they thought they knew gets a truer spine. Exhibit 2 was the prenup. Nora read the key clauses into plain English. The original Harrington parcel and all pre-existing trust assets remain outside the marital estate. Emergency transfer rights route to the trust if abuse or incapacity appears. No accusation, only grammar. The words landed with the quiet inevitability of a tide chart. Exhibit 3, the will and the transfer on death, brought Emily into the room in a way that stung and steadied at once. The dispositive sections drew a clean line. Any residual interest she held would pass to Harbor Light Trust. I was granted life tenancy in the carriage house. The trustee, me, held authority over maintenance and occupancy of the main house. Keepsakes were to be preserved. Pastor inclined his head. I pressed my thumb into my palm until I could feel a pulse and not a tremor. Paul rose only long enough to do what was his to do. Payment continuity is clear, he said. Taxes, insurance, and maintenance have been dispersed from trust-linked accounts for the duration of the period in question. The ledgers align with the bank summaries. He didn't name amounts. He didn't need to. Continuity was the point. Denise stepped to the end of Nora's table with Exhibit 5, the perimeter piece. She laid down time-stamped stills, the smart lock administrator change, the shed keypad denial, entries and attempts arranged like footprints in wet sand. Restricting a life tenant's access to tools and keepsakes is problematic, she said. Her tone was as neutral as graph paper. Evidence does not shout. Nora issued printed notices next, cease and desist on rental listings and showings, no entry to the carriage house, no disposal of keepsakes, no further lock changes pending formal orders. She handed one to Chase. He signed the delivery receipt without looking at his own signature. Then she read the will aloud, the operative sections, not the private note Emily had left me. The room changed temperature. I heard the cadence of my daughter's caution and care in the legal phrasing she had chosen, the way she tucked intention into verbs that hold up in bad weather. There are sentences that cut and suture in the same motion. These did. Chase rose with his notice in hand and the old bravado trying to surface. I have spousal rights, he said. I served a 30-day notice. Nora did not blink. A unilateral notice cannot supersede a premarital trust reinforced by a transfer on death designation under Maine law, she said. You're welcome to retain counsel. Today we're here to inform, not to argue. While he stood there, Lexi fidgeted with her phone. A small red dot winked in the reflection of a picture frame. Someone near her hissed, and she dropped the phone to her lap, lips tight. It doesn't take much for a slice of a moment to leave a room. A sliver of audio, a scanned page, a line of Nora's cease and desist, and the door was cracked for the storm that travels by fiber. Pastor closed us with a benediction so brief it felt like a hand on a shoulder. Nora stated next steps without drama. Filings for status quo and protective orders, scheduling a hearing if necessary, mutual instructions to de-escalate. Papers went back into binders. Chairs sighed. The rain on the roof grew louder as if the building approved of the order we had made inside it. In the vestibule, I held the satchel like a tool bag. The sealed envelope with Emily's handwriting lay against the canvas and my ribs. Chase stood near the door, lips pressed white, doing the kind of math that forgets to count costs you cannot bill to someone else. I had a choice then to turn and say something small and victorious. I did not. I tipped my head to Pastor, to Nora, to the faces that had held steady while paper spoke. Then I stepped out into the wet light and let the rain rinse the day from my coat. What came next would be measured, not loud, a choice narrow as a keel and just as steady. Rain pooled in the vestibule as though the building itself were wringing out its sleeves. I stood with the satchel under my coat and let the noise of chairs scraping fade behind me. There was a shape inside my chest that had wanted a quick, bright victory, but it passed like lightning behind clouds. This wasn't a contest. It was guardianship of Emily's intent, of the square of wind my father once named, of the quiet inside a house that had carried more than its share. Nora tapped my elbow and steered me into a side office the size of a skiff. The window fogged at the corners. A kettle on a metal tray clicked as it cooled. She drew two paths on legal pad lines, the hard push and the measured one. The first was sharp and immediate, unlawful detainer filing, emergency eviction, a press of complaints about locks and attempts to dispose of keepsakes. The second put steel inside calm, file for status quo and protective orders, serve cease and desist, extend a brief exact grace window that allowed Chase to leave without public spectacle if he kept to the terms. She spoke without appetite for drama, just the plain cadence of a craftsperson explaining tools. I chose the slower iron. I told her I wanted safety and truth, not a story that ran loose. She wrote as I spoke. Status quo order today, protective order if needed, a letter that set conditions and consequences in simple lines. Deadline, Monday, 10 a.m. to vacate the main house. Immediate end to listings and showings. No entry to the carriage house. No disposal of keepsakes and a restoration of the photos where they had been found. She added acknowledgement lines and a place for time of service because paper without receipts is a wish. Pastor Carter appeared at the door with the sound a gentle boat makes against a dock. I asked if he would keep a small thing for me later, a hand-drawn nautical map Emily once made on the kitchen table, routes threaded to islands we never reached together. He nodded and said he'd be honored. There are some agreements you don't write down because the people in them were taught to keep their word. Paul met me in the hall with a banker's economy. If any irregular activity hit the maintenance or property accounts, his team would freeze it pending verification. If Chase's counsel came calling, he would offer a concise statement confirming payment continuity stretching back years. He didn't say the number of Christmases those payments had crossed, but I knew them by the way the roof still held. Denise waited at the back doors and spoke the way former officers do when they're trying to leave you your dignity. Photograph the shed keypad again, record the status of the smart lock, keep the incident log current. She offered to be present when the papers were served. I said I preferred fewer uniforms and less lines were crossed. She put 2 fingers to the bill of her cap and said she'd be 5 minutes away if needed. Service happened in the vestibule on table wood polished by generations of coffee urns. Nora handed Chase the conditions letter and the cease and desist. Her voice stayed level. Lexi hovered with her phone pushed halfway into a pocket so it would look like a decision. Chase reached for spousal rights and transition plans the way a man reaches for a railing in the dark. Then he looked down at the stack, trust chain, prenup, will, and transfer on death, notices with lines for receipt, and something in him sagged a degree you could measure with a level. He signed the acknowledgments. Nora dated them. When he looked up, I wasn't there to receive whatever expression came next. I thanked those who had kept the room honest, Nora for the spine of it, Pastor for the steadiness, Paul for the numbers that didn't wobble, Denise for the perimeter, and I stepped back into rain that had found its range. The satchel rode high under my coat like a heart. At home, I began with small acts that announced calm. The framed photographs Lexi had stacked face down on the sideboard went back on the mantel in their original order, Emily's eyes returning to the room. I powered the smart speaker down so the house would not answer to any commands that didn't sound like family. On the fridge, I taped a note in block letters. Status quo in effect. No listings, no lock changes. Monday, 10 a.m. deadline. It wasn't a threat, it was a schedule. Service happened in the vestibule on table wood polished by generations of coffee urns. Nora handed Chase the conditions letter and the cease and desist. Her voice stayed level. Lexi hovered with her phone pushed halfway into a pocket so it would look like a decision. Chase reached for spousal rights and transition plans the way a man reaches for a railing in the dark. Then he looked down at the stack, trust chain, prenup, will, and transfer on death, notices with lines for receipt. And something in him sagged a degree you could measure with a level. He signed the acknowledgments. Nora dated them. When he looked up, I wasn't there to receive whatever expression came next. I thanked those who had kept the room honest. Nora for the spine of it, Pastor for the steadiness, Paul for the numbers that didn't wobble, Denise for the perimeter, and I stepped back into rain that had found its range. The satchel rode high under my coat like a heart. At home, I began with small acts that announced calm. The framed photographs Lexi had stacked face down on the sideboard went back on the mantel in their original order, Emily's eyes returning to the room. I powered the smart speaker down so the house would not answer to any commands that didn't sound like family. On the fridge, I taped a note in block letters, status quo in effect, no listings, no lock changes. Monday, 10 a.m. deadline. It wasn't a threat, it was a schedule. I checked the carriage house deadbolt and felt the honest weight of a mechanical latch doing what it was born to do. At the shed keypad, I entered the code I once knew and watched the denial flash red. I took a photograph with the reflection of my shoulder and the timestamp in the same frame, then wrote the details in the incident log: hour, weather, device status, any words spoken. Documentation is the opposite of shouting. It lets you hear yourself later. I gave Chase a short boundary statement at the threshold of the main house. He could pack clothes and work documents until Monday morning. Anything he moved, he needed to put back. He was not to touch anything labeled Emily or shop, and there would be no more photos, no staging. He nodded as if the words pressed into him physically. Understood, I said, to mark that I had witnessed his nod, and stepped back. Inside the carriage house, the room smelled like cedar and paper. I set Emily's sealed envelope on the drafting table and did not open it. Strength wasn't in whatever it said. Strength was in the fact that it existed and in the work we had already done to honor it. I slid the yellow 30-day notice under the cedar block again, the ritual that told my hands they had finished their part for now. Outside, the rain ticked softer on the clapboards as if the weather had read the new rules. Near dusk, my phone trembled with the small rattle of a text. 2 neighbors sent links to a local group where a short clip from the hall had begun to circulate. A slice of Nora's reading, the corner of a cease and desist, the kind of sliver that travels faster than explanation. I turned off notifications and wrote one line in the log. Public ripple observed. No response. The house stays out of arguments it didn't start. By the time the light thinned to iron, the satchel was unpacked and Nora's filings were printed and stacked. I sat at the drafting table with the clock loud enough to be honest and waited for the clerk's timestamp to hit Nora's portal. Wind shifted off the bay and the rain slackened. Somewhere a gull decided the day had said enough. Consequences were already walking toward us, slower than fury, but steadier. I breathed the way carpenters do when the last board drops into place without a tap, and I let the quiet hold. Saturday woke the bay like a patient coming out from under anesthesia. Gray first, then a plate of glass catching a narrow stripe of sun. I was up before the gulls quarried the parking lot at the bait shop. The barometer by the shop door had crept up a notch. I ran a fingertip over the glass as if I could tidy weather. Perimeter walk next, clapboards, window latches, the shed keypad still blinking its small red refusal. I logged the time, wind direction, and the nothing that had happened overnight. After storms, the body wants the ritual of nothing happened. Nora called soon after. Her voice was brisk, the sound of stamped filings. The clerk had received the status quo motions. She penciled a hearing midweek, if needed. No public commentary, she reminded me. Paper needed quiet to do its work. I agreed and set my phone face down. Paul's email landed like a weight on a sheet. Concise, neutral, maintenance and property disbursements frozen to essential only. Alerts added to accounts. He attached a 3-sentence letter confirming payment continuity should counsel inquire. He did not write numbers, but I saw them in the years I'd patched roofs and renewed policies while pretending I was only tending wood. I restored the living room the way you reseat a plank, one clean press. The frames Lexi had stacked face down returned to the mantel in their original order. The chair she angled toward the staged horizon turned to face the real one. Emily's gray shawl went back on its hook where the wall knew its weight. I powered the smart speaker off again and taped a second copy of the status quo note near the entry. The house exhaled, not happily. Houses don't do happy, but with something like alignment. Chase packed in the untheatrical hush cardboard demands. I heard tape lift and tear, the clink of binders, the soft thud of shoes into a bag. From the doorway, I said only what we had agreed: clothes and work documents, restore anything you move, no photos, no staging. He obeyed the sentences like guardrails. Twice he paused at frames he'd pushed aside earlier, and the pause lived in the tendons of his neck. Grief has bad manners when it finally shows up. Neighbors used the weather as permission to appear. Pete dropped a coil of extension cord I hadn't asked for and said he was sorry he hadn't spoken sooner. Mrs. Connolly left blueberry bars with a murmured, "For later." I answered with the same tool I use on misfitting joints: steady pressure, no spectacle. "We're keeping it quiet," I said. "Facts, not noise." They nodded like people who have shoveled before dawn. I set Emily's sealed envelope on the mantel and did not open it. The point was not to mine words for strength I already had. The point was to guard what she had already said with her filings. I wrote "keepsakes intact" in the log the way you write "plum" beside a measurement you've checked twice. By afternoon, my phone thrummed in a small cascade. More messages about a short clip from the hall circulating in a neighborhood Facebook group. Nora's voice reading the edge of a cease and desist. I did not respond. I added a line to the log: public ripple ongoing, no engagement. Houses rot from leaks you ignore. I wasn't going to let attention become weather. Denise returned for a proof pass. With my nod, she photographed the restored photos and the taped notes, then rechecked the shed keypad, which continued its little red sermon. She took copies of my log pages to staple to the intake. "We're 5 minutes away," she said, meaning the station, meaning help if lines were crossed. I thanked her, which here sounds like, "Keep your coat on." Sunday I worked the yard. Hydrangeas got their winter haircut. I hauled branches the storm had shaken loose and righted 2 stones along the path where the frost heave had nudged them sideways. The body needs to carry weight you can see after it's been carrying, kinds you can't. Neighbors waved from sidewalks, some with capped travel mugs, some with the bright faces people put on when they're sorry. I waved back and kept the rake moving. Nora relayed a reporter's inquiry by text. I declined. If a statement became necessary later, it would be brief, written, and about elder protection and documentation, not blame. I saved the draft phrase in my head and went back to raking. I called Pastor Carter and asked if I could bring Emily's nautical map after the move-out for safekeeping. He said yes, and I pictured it rolled in twine on the church office cabinet, a small latitude held out of reach of gossip. Sunday night, Chase knocked. His voice was flat. "I'll meet the Monday 10 a.m. deadline," he said, and asked if he could leave a forwarding address for stray mail. "You can," I said, "restore anything you move." He nodded. The exchange was so clean it almost squeaked. Monday morning came with a sky the color of a quarter. The process server brought final papers. Chase signed the move-out acknowledgement and placed his house keys on the table like a man laying down a tool he never learned to use. He lifted a small box from his coat pocket and held it out. "She wanted this to go back to you." Inside lay Emily's promise ring, tiny as a breath. I logged the handover, closed the lid, and slid the box into my palm where a pulse could find it. He carried 2 bags to a waiting car and drove away without honking. The bay gleamed cold as a blade. I stood on the stoop with the satchel and the ring box and let the quiet I had fought for settle around the clapboards. Repair and rebuilding would begin now: legal housekeeping, trust housekeeping, the work you do when weather goes out and leaves you the house again. Monday light came in clear and salt bright, angling across the floorboards as if the house had rinsed its lungs. The main rooms were finally quiet. No stacked boxes, no binder on the table, my tape notes still squared on the fridge like a flag that it held. I stood in the doorway long enough to feel the air decide to be ordinary again, then lifted the canvas satchel and carried it back to the carriage house. Today would be for repair and rebuilding, not defense. Nora called as I set the bag on the drafting table. Her voice had the brisk steadiness of a good tide. The clerk's stamps were filed, the status quo orders now more archive than weapon. Phase 2, she said, meaning housekeeping the trust in the house. We would refresh Harbor Light trust records, place a short memo of occupancy control in the file, update insurance on both structures, and schedule a berm inspection before the next nor'easter. She emailed a checklist while we spoke. I printed it, clipped it to a battered clipboard, and hung it on a nail above the planer where to-do lists earn their keep. Paul's message arrived a moment later, a tidy return to normal. Essential disbursements would unfreeze, dual verification added for contractor invoices, quarterly maintenance audits scheduled. He'd prepared a plain template letter to confirm payment continuity for any future inquiries. I replied that Friday worked for signatures and authorizations. He wrote back one line, "Steady as she goes," and I felt the phrase settle into the room. I rolled open the carriage house doors. The incident log moved to the side like a tool finished with and ready for the drawer. I vacuumed the winter sawdust, oiled the planer bed until it gleamed, and replaced a chipped chisel I'd kept too long out of sentiment. On the wall, I rehung a card I'd lettered years ago: measure twice, document once, speak low. The room answered in the small way shops do, motors sounding truer, light setting on the bench like it had been missed. From the bedroom closet, I retrieved Emily's nautical map and slid it into a protective tube with a cotton tie. The pencil routes she'd drawn up the coast looked like veins under skin. I wrote a note for Pastor Carter, hold for 1 week, anchor grief out of reach of traffic, and laid the tube by the door. The church office was where this should breathe for a while, high on a shelf where hands wouldn't paw at it during casseroles and condolences. I phoned the pastor and asked about an evening talk for seniors and adult children. Nothing dramatic, just a small session on elder financial safety and documentation. Trusts, wills, incident logs, boundaries. He liked the idea. Nora offered to lend a 1-page handout. Denise said she could add a home perimeter checklist, locks, camera placement, where to keep copies so emergencies don't scatter them. The tone would be practical. Mercy wears work clothes here. The email from the Veterans Housing nonprofit landed while we were setting the time. Winter home repair days needed carpenters and advice givers. I signed up for Saturday and sketched a quick demo on window flashing and sill rot triage onto a yellow pad. Purpose returns most reliably through the hands. Denise knocked at midday with a bucket of screws and the grin of someone who prefers hardware to speeches. Together, we added a mechanical backup hasp to the shed, labeled new key sets, and printed a plain property access policy: who may enter, when, and why. One copy went into the lockbox with the trust papers, another into an envelope addressed to Nora. She stood back, checked sight lines, and said, "Simple holds." It does. Before lunch, I wrote the final entry in the incident log: vacated, keys returned, keepsakes intact, repairs scheduled, public ripple ignored. The graphite line felt like a keel. I set the log into the lockbox and shut the lid, listening to the small certainties: brass on steel, hinge true, evidence becoming archive. Mrs. Connolly and Pete appeared in the mid-afternoon with cookies and a ladder, neighborly currency. I invited them to the church talk. "No speeches required," I said, "just company." Pete leaned the ladder against the porch post and left it like a handshake. We talked about weather because weather is how you say you care without making anyone flinch. Near dusk, I walked the tube to the church office. Pastor Carter set it on a high shelf, then said one sentence about keeping memory safe. I thanked him with the quiet grammar of men who fix things rather than name feelings. On the way home, the wind cut clean, and I let it. Back in the shop, I chalked a resilience list on the wall. Duplicate keys off-site. Copies of trust and will in 3 places. Emergency contact card on the fridge. Annual photo inventory of contents. Contractor vetting list with references. Quarterly payment audit with Paul. I underlined audit and capped the chalk. I sent 5 texts inviting friends and 2 neighbors to chowder night next week. No stories required, I wrote. Just soup. The old Dutch oven Emily liked was already on the stove, enamel chipped honest at the rim. The house approved the plan by staying quiet. When I opened a window, evening came in like clean linen, cold, salt, and a little pine from somewhere upwind. I touched the cedar paperweight and found it holding a to-do list instead of a notice. The substitution felt like a prayer answered by practice. I thought of Emily's sealed envelope and left it closed. Some shores you reach only when the water slackens completely. Before lights out, I taped a card above the drafting table and wrote one sentence in block letters: dignity first, facts second, noise never. The words caught the lamp's last gold and fixed themselves like coordinates. My phone buzzed with 2 short notes. Nora confirming the hearing was canceled due to voluntary compliance. Paul confirming Friday's slot. I slid the phone face down, turned off the shop light, and stood in the doorway until the dark made a shape I recognized. The frames on the wall seemed to resume their original weight. The ending phase had arrived: settlement, legacy, and the work that remains when weather moves on. Late winter tipped towards spring the way a body comes off a long watch. Stiff first, then willing. The bay went steel blue under a brighter sun, and the remnants of snow hid in the shade like shy animals. Inside, the house carried a quieter weight. After so much weather, equilibrium has its own sound. Furnace low, clock honest, floorboards remembering how to warm. Harbor light ran clean. Nora filed the last updated pages. The insurance binders were bound again for both the main house and the carriage house, deductibles where they ought to be, riders where wind insists. A quarterly maintenance audit calendar hung by the drafting table, penciled tight as a ship's log. The berm inspection turned up a few modest notes: reset 2 stones, add a drain cut by the hydrangeas, but no surprises. At the bank, Paul and I signed authorizations in a small room that smelled like envelopes. "Steady lanes only," he said, and I nodded. A trust is just a kind of roadway. You keep it painted and keep it clear. I made a decision about the main house, not because I needed rent to breathe, but because a house needs breath in it. A young couple, Lena, a teacher at the elementary school, and Marcus, an EMT who knows every bad turn on Shore Road, walked through with careful hands and eyes that saw the work in things. The lease we settled on had conditions that sounded like our town: storm prep participation, respect for keepsakes policy, and a slot on the neighborhood watch rotation. In the basement, I showed them the shut-off valves like heirlooms and ran a sump test with the switch that sticks. Out back, I walked them along the boulder line and told the story of the nor'easter that taught those stones where to stand. Knowledge turned into inheritance without speeches. For clarity, Nora drafted a short memo about my life estate in the carriage house and tucked a copy with the lease. Keys were labeled plainly. The property access policy hung inside my shop door. The labels looked simple and were. Simple holds. The repair work shifted from defense to craft. I milled cedar for a bench destined for the bluff path, rails beveled to shed weather, slats spaced to let the wind sing instead of pry. On the top rail, I carved Emily Harrington in a hand slow enough to be faithful. Thin coats of spar varnish went on like promises, never thick, never rushed, built for weather you know is coming. Chowder night returned the house to its chosen register. The Dutch oven threw an old heat. Neighbors set down bowls and stories about boat ramps, a sale on deck screws, the price of salt. The talk was ordinary on purpose. No one rehearsed the past. The point was to practice normal until our hands remembered. A few evenings later, we held the church talk Pastor and I had sketched. Nora stood at a folding table with a one-page handout about trusts, wills, and incident logs, plain headings, check boxes, no scare tactics. Denise passed a home perimeter checklist that covered locks, cameras, and where to keep copies so emergencies don't scatter them. A widow asked for an incident log template and said she wished she'd known the word sooner. We printed 3 for her while the urn coughed out coffee that tasted like every church kitchen I've ever known. The turnout was modest and exactly right. Pastor and I used the quiet in his office to seed something small, the Emily Harrington Shop Class Scholarship, for a high schooler who builds a project the town can touch. We put in the first dollars without ceremony. The bench on the bluff would be the first example when we wrote the note for applicants. Work you can sit on counts double. A short email arrived from Chase, stripped of anything but facts. He was living with his mother in Bangor, working at a smaller firm starting therapy. He asked if he could send flowers on Emily's birthday. I replied with one line granting permission and restated the boundaries. Mercy is sometimes just the absence of flourish. Online, the flicker of the live stream fragment found its level and went out. A neighbor posted thanks to the church for the seminar. Nora sent a link to the handouts. Spectacle surrendered to useful quiet, the way a gust falls behind a hill. Paul came by for the first quarterly review with a folder that did not rattle. We matched invoices to work orders, checked dual signatures, and crossed out a contractor whose references thinned under the slightest pressure. We drank coffee at the drafting table and argued gently about the best way to label receipts so winter hands could find them. Administration, done right, turns into a form of care. At week's end, Pastor brought back Emily's nautical map in the same tube I'd handed over. I framed it above the drafting table where my eye lifts naturally when a cut resists. The room's gravity changed. The map stopped being undertow. It became heading. It told me where to look when a line needed straightening. On a clear afternoon, Pete and I carried the bench to the bluff path while Mrs. Connolly brought a wrench and a thermos like a procession. Bolts bit into bedrock with the good sound. We stepped back without commentary and let the bay throw a sheet of light across the letters. Wind braided through the slats exactly as planned. Craft gives grief somewhere decent to sit. Back home, I looked at Emily's sealed envelope again and left it closed. Some things wait best when the calendar holds no errands. I wrote "later is allowed" on a sticky note and stuck it to the inside of the cupboard where the good tape lives. Permission tastes better when it's quiet. Evening settled into its old places. The tenant's porch light glowed a steady amber. My shop window pushed a warm rectangle onto what snow the shade still kept. The cedar paperweight pinned grocery lists and a Saturday demo outline for window flashing at the Veterans Repair Day. The furnace sighed once, satisfied. The clock kept time without apology. I drafted a short card for the seminar follow-up and the shop wall both. Dignity first, facts second, noise never. And taped the motto under the framed map where sun would find it early. Tomorrow I'd send thank you notes and plane the bench's edges one last time. The lesson had arrived without preaching. You make a keel, you keep it straight, and you trust it to run true no matter the chop. Morning came clear and cold, the bay a sheet of steel blue under a pale sun. I brewed coffee and stood in the doorway of the shop until the heat found my hands. The motto card above the drafting table caught the light. Dignity first. Facts second. Noise never. And I decided to set down what this passage had taught me, if only so the words would be there on a day I might forget. The house sounded like a house again, furnace low, clock honest, none of the held breath that had crept into the joist during the worst of it. I began with thank yous because gratitude keeps edges from rusting. I wrote short notes by hand, one to Pastor Carter for the steadying prayer and the loan of a shelf, one to Nora for the clear spine she gave the papers, one to Paul for lanes that stayed painted, one to Denise for perimeter wisdom that never needed volume. In each envelope, I tucked a photocopy of the resilience checklist from the shop wall. Duplicate keys off-site. Copies of trust and will in 3 places. Emergency contact card on the fridge. Annual photo inventory. Contractor vetting. Quarterly audit. A token that order wasn't just for a storm, but for weather yet to come. The church list got a quiet email. I linked to Nora's one page on documents and Denise's home perimeter sheet and wrote 2 simple sentences about how to start an incident log. Date, time, fact, nothing decorative. I kept my name small. Resources, not story. The reply pings came back over an hour like single oar strokes. I drafted a 4-sentence statement for the folder marked Press, something I'd release only if asked again. Elder protection is a matter of documentation and boundaries. Grief is not an administrative window. Civility multiplies the force of truth. Please respect privacy. I printed it, signed it, and slid it behind the handouts. Preparation over performance. Forgiveness, if it comes, will be a road and not a door. Behavior will walk it, not promises. I'm not there. Perhaps I will be one day, and if I am, it will be because time and action built the distance needed to see straight. In the meantime, check-ins can exist without reopening wounds, flowers on Emily's birthday, a short acknowledgement from me, nothing more. I set down the plain list I wish I'd seen on a bulletin board a decade ago, but I wrote it as a paragraph so it would read like a neighbor speaking across a fence. Paper is a language. Speak it early with trusts, wills, transfer on death designations, and, if it fits a family, a prenup that says which parcel answers to whom. Document quietly. Incident log, photos, receipts, timestamps. Keep mechanical fallbacks for when smart goes dumb. A deadbolt you can feel, a hasp that shuts in weather. Invite the right witnesses. The presence of steady people is a brace, not a crowd. And keep the order that saved us. Dignity first, facts second, noise never. I penciled a plan for a monthly shop and paper hour in the carriage house. Half an hour sharpening chisels and planes, half an hour on the paperwork basics nobody teaches in homeroom. First session would be chisel edges and incident logs. I pictured 3 or 4 chairs, coffee and mismatched mugs, the simple relief of skills traded among neighbors. The drafting table got its own reset. I tidied the receipts and moved the cedar paperweight so it pinned only a grocery list and a sketch for the veteran's demo. The sealed letter from Emily stayed on the high shelf, saved for a soft day, not today. There is mercy in refusing to wring history for comfort when present tools will do. I walked to the bluff at noon, the bench throwing a clean shadow on frost-burned grass. My hand found the curve of the Emily Harrington carving and traced the groove as if to test the varnish. I promised to re-varnish each spring and to fund the scholarship every year I'm able. The wind answered through the slats, a quiet metronome that set the tempo for work ahead. Back at the shop, I wrote a card for the lockbox, a note to a future version of me who might be tired and tempted to speak before thinking, if you're reading this after a hard day, call Nora, call Paul, call Pastor, take a walk to the bench. Write in the log before you speak. I slid it behind the trust papers and let the lid close with its small, satisfying click. I sent a brief message to Chase. I acknowledged that flowers on Emily's birthday would be acceptable and restated the boundary: no unannounced visits. If he wanted to learn the paper language that protects families, the church seminar would be there. That was all. Mercy without surrender, typed in a font that didn't raise its voice. Pete came by to return the ladder and to complain about a storm window that sticks. Mrs. Connolly left a thermos for tomorrow's repair demo and said she would save a seat for the shop and paper night. We stood in the driveway talking about a shipment of cedar and the rumor of late snow. Normal is the kind of ending you don't notice until it's safely in your pocket. I laid out sample sill sections and, flashing on the workbench, set 10 copies of the resilience list to the side and added the motto in small type at the bottom of each handout. The kit looked modest and enough. When I clicked off the heater, the shop held the day's gathered order like a good haul. So I wrote, finally, the paragraph that explains everything to me. We safeguard love with paper and patience. We answer cruelty with boundaries. We practice mercy without surrender. We keep our homes by keeping our word. The words felt earned, not arranged. I taped them beneath the framed nautical map so the last light could touch them before it left. Evening gathered. The map caught a final stripe of gold, the lamp clicked off, and the room folded into quiet. Outside, the bay exhaled the clean breath it gives to those who've made their lines true. Tomorrow I'll plane a stubborn edge smooth and teach someone how to hear a chisel when it's right. The keel is set for whatever water comes. In the end, the storm wasn't beaten by force, but by a steady creed. Dignity first, facts second, noise never. Paper became a compass, boundaries the seawall, and patience the keel that kept the hull true when the water chopped. Grief found a bench to sit on, not because sorrow shrank, but because craft made a place for it. Measured, sanded, sealed against weather, home revealed itself as stewardship, not possession. A promise you renew in the quiet work of mending what time and tempers fray. Justice arrived without spectacle, the way light returns after fog. Ordinary, sufficient, enough to see the next right task. And mercy, when it came, did not excuse harm. It simply refused to surrender the horizon. We carry forward like that, tightening what's loose, recording what's true, and handing the tools to the next set of hands so the line stays straight. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story stirred something in you, questions, memories, or lessons, share your thoughts below so others can learn from them too. We read every comment. If you'd like more narratives about resilience, justice, and the quiet work of rebuilding, tap subscribe and turn on notifications. Your voice helps our community stay thoughtful, kind, and brave. We're grateful you're here. See you in the next story. Noticed a standout moment? Drop the timestamp to help others find the heart.